Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Office Hours AZ 104 exam webinar. We are so excited to have you with us today and are honored to be part of your Azure journey. My name is Tia Gamble, as many of you have known because I send you all these emails from Cloud Academy. But before I let Guy take the lead and really give you guys all the information that you're really here for, I do have a few reminders. So the first is this webinar will be recorded and shared with you via email within the next 36 hours. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar, so you have the opportunity to submit your questions using the questions box in your attendee control panel. Additionally, at the conclusion of today's webinar, there will be a brief 2-minute survey. We truly value your feedback because it helps us improve the content we offer and your future webinar experience with us. So please take a moment to fill out that survey at the conclusion of this webinar. So without further ado, I'll let Guy introduce himself and take the lead.
Okay, let's get started. I'm Guy Hummel, and I'm the Azure Content Director at Cloud Academy. We're going to start off with just a few details about the AZ-104 exam, and then we'll spend the majority of our time going over sample questions. I do this because I've found that when people are preparing to take an exam, the thing they need the most is to go through some sample
Hello.
questions so they can get some practice and get an idea of how to analyze a question and break it down and figure out how to answer it. Then I'll go through a few exam tips for how to prepare for the exam and also for taking the exam itself, the real exam from Microsoft. And then finally, we'll have a question and answer session. So if you think of any questions as we're going through this, write them down, and when we get to that part, you can ask them. All right, prerequisites. There aren't any. You don't need to take the AZ-900 exam or anything like that. You can just go straight in and take the AZ-104 exam. And the exam is 2 hours long, which is quite a while, but it's not the longest Azure exam there is. Number of questions, it does vary a bit. It's usually around 50, but somewhere between 40 and 60. And that's all that Microsoft will say. They don't have a set number of questions. Now, for the types of questions, Microsoft has quite a variety of question types. They're quite a bit different from the other cloud vendors this way. They do have multiple choice questions like everybody does, but they also have some other really interesting ones. Now, this one is a type that they seem to really like these days, and you'll see these types of questions on pretty much every exam. And I call them true false with repeated scenario. So here's how it works. They give you some usually relatively short scenario, some situation that you're in, and you need to solve some kind of a problem. And so then they put a proposed solution there, and they ask you, will this solve the problem? And you just have to say yes or no. And then when you hit next, they'll give you the same scenario again, but this time they'll give you a different solution. And they'll ask you, will this solution work? And so sometimes when you do this, you'll realize, oh, actually, when I said yes on the previous solution, that was wrong because this one is correct and that one was missing something. But they don't let you go back. So there's no previous button at this point. So you can go back and change your answer. And so when you answer this one, you click next, you go on to a third one. There are always three. And they give you another solution, and you have to say whether that one is the correct solution or not. And sometimes, potentially all of them could be correct, all of them could be incorrect, or any mixture in between. And so even though these are true false questions, which usually people think of as being easy types of questions, they're actually quite difficult and stressful because you can't go back. Then there's drag and drop. And there are a few different ways that they do this. And I'm actually going to show you one example of this in one of my sample questions. But the basic idea is that they have some answers that you can drag over to fill in some blanks or something like that. Similar to the drag and drop, there's choosing from drop-down menus where sometimes the drop-downs will be in to fill in blanks, and you click on the drop-down menu and it will give you some choices for potential answers to put in these blanks. They have a few different ways they use drop-down menus as well. Case studies. Case studies can be quite difficult because they'll give you a lot of information that you have to read through, and then they'll ask you anywhere from probably about 4 questions to 8 questions, something like that, all based on the same case study. And so you'll actually have to read different parts of the case study to answer these different questions. Not all exams have case studies on them, but the AZ 104 exam normally does have at least one. And there could possibly be other types as well. In fact, in the sample questions, I'll show you some slightly different types as well. So Microsoft has quite a variety of question types on its exams. Okay, on to the topics. I'm just going to go through the major topic headings here. I'm not going to go in detail into everything that's in the exam guide. So to start, there's Manage Azure Identities and Governance. So this is dealing with things like Azure Active Directory especially. Then there's Implement and Manage Storage. And so this is mostly about Azure Storage, of course. There's Deploy and Manage Azure Compute Resources. So this includes things like virtual machines and also Azure Kubernetes Service for containers. Configure and manage virtual networking. There's actually a lot on networking, probably more than you'd expect. So this includes not just virtual networks, but other network technologies as well, like Azure Virtual Gateway, for example, or Azure Load Balancer, things like that. And finally, there's monitor and backup Azure resources. And so not surprisingly, the two biggest services here are Azure Monitor and Azure Backup. So the most important services to know, these are more or less in order of how many questions you'll see on the exam. Now that can vary, of course, from exam to exam because they have a large pool of questions, but yeah, this should give you a good idea of some of the most popular ones that you'll see on the exam. So there's Azure Storage, Azure Active Directory, virtual machines, network security groups. Now this was on the exam more than I expected. This is yet another one of these networking technologies. And there's actually quite a bit to know about network security groups. So make sure you know that one. Azure Backup, Azure Load Balancer. I've mentioned quite a few of these already. Virtual Network Gateway, which is also known as VPN Gateway. Azure Monitor and Azure Network Watcher. Azure App Service, which is sort of an alternative to using virtual machines or Azure Kubernetes Service. Azure DNS for name resolution. Role-based access control for giving different permissions to different users. And Azure Kubernetes Service, again, for container orchestration. Now, these are not the only services you need to know. There are lots of services you need to know for this exam, but these ones will almost certainly be on the exam. In fact, I would almost guarantee that you will see questions on these ones on the exam. Okay, now on to the fun part, the sample questions. Sample question number 1. You're creating an ARM template, that is an Azure Resource Manager template, to provision virtual machines. You need to set the Windows Administrator password for the virtual machines, but you don't want the password to be visible in the ARM template file. Which is the best service to help you accomplish this task? Azure Active Directory? That seems like maybe it's a possibility, but probably not. Azure VM Agent? Well, this is definitely something related to controlling a virtual machine, so it seems like a possibility. Multi-factor authentication? Well, this is to do with authentication, so it seems like maybe there's something there. And then Azure Key Vault. Well, if you know what Azure Key Vault does, which is that it stores keys and secrets and things that you want to keep private, this does seem like a very good possibility. So even if you didn't know that this is the best way to get a password for an ARM template file, you could probably guess that this is the correct answer just from the nature of what the service is. So this is a pretty easy question actually, but if you didn't know very much about Azure, it would actually be kind of hard to guess. Most of the questions will probably be more difficult than this one. I'll just tell you. I'm starting off with a relatively easy question. Question number 2. You have the following storage accounts on Azure. So I've got the names on the left and the type of Azure storage on the right. So storage 1 is Q storage. Storage 2 has blob storage. Storage 3 has table storage. And storage 4 has Azure Files. Now, if you use the Azure Import-Export service, are the following statements true or false? So I should just say that this is yet another question type that I didn't mention before. Microsoft does this quite often on exams. They will have, it's typically 3 questions, and each one of them is essentially a true-false question. So basically what Microsoft does is they don't want to have just true-false questions, because then you have a 50-50 chance of being right. So this is one way they deal with that problem. If they have 3 questions on the same page, you'd have to get all 3 of them right to get full points for this question, right? So that gives you a lot less chance than 50%. Okay, so the first one is, you can import into storage 1 and storage 2, yes or no? So storage 1 is Q storage and 2 is blob storage. So you have to know what the Azure Import Export service supports. Now you might think that it supports all of them, but it doesn't. It turns out that you can't import into Q storage. So that means that the first question is no. You can import into blob storage, but it's asking if you can import into both of them. So it's no. Next one is, you can export from storage 4. Now it turns out that actually there's a difference between import and export as well, in terms of what the import-export service will support. So even though you can actually import into Azure Files, you can't export from Azure Files. So the answer, again, is no. The third one, you can import into storage 2 and storage 4. So that's importing into blob storage and file storage. Those are the 2 you can import into. So you can only import into those 2 types, and you can only export from blob storage. All right, so the answer to this one is yes. So this is actually a pretty tricky question, because you'd have to know those very specific details of what the Azure Import-Export service supports, which types it supports, under import scenarios and under export scenarios. All right, number 3. Your organization needs to allow its employees to access corporate resources using their personal devices, such as tablets and smartphones. Which of the following would need to be done in device settings in Azure Active Directory so that users can add their own devices? First one is, a global administrator sets users may join devices to Azure AD to all. The next one is, an owner, rather than a global administrator, sets users may register their devices with Azure AD to all. So if you just look at the answers sort of quickly, you take a high-level view of the answers, there are really 2 different things that are changing. One of them is, it's either a global administrator or an owner who's doing this. And the second thing is, they're either setting users may join devices to Azure AD, or they're setting users may register their devices with Azure AD. Right? The next 2, C and D, they're just variations of the first 2, right? So we're just mixing these up a little bit. So you have to figure out 2 different things. You have to know whether it's a global administrator or an owner who can set this setting, and you need to know what the setting is. So it turns out in this case that a global administrator can do this, but an owner can't. A global administrator isn't the only one. That's not the only role that works in this case. There are some other ones, like cloud device administrator is another one, for example. And there are 2 more, I believe. But global administrator for sure will work. So that's the first part. The second part is, users may join devices to Azure AD, or users may register their devices with Azure AD. So you have to know the difference between joining and registering. Joining is only for Windows 10 devices. Right? That's how you you join a Windows 10 computer to a domain, to an Azure AD domain. So because the question mentioned tablets and smartphones, which are not Windows 10 devices, joining is not going to work. Registering is what you need to do. So if you're dealing with other devices other than Windows 10 computers, registering is what you need to do. So that means the answer is C, because it's a global administrator and its users may register their devices with Azure AD. All right. Question number 4. You need to back up 10 virtual machines using Azure Backup immediately. Which 4 steps need to be performed? Drag them to the box on the right and put them in the correct order. So this is an example of a drag and drop question, like I mentioned earlier. In this case, you're not actually just filling in a blank. You have to put these into a particular order. So what's interesting about this is that they've asked you to put the 4 steps in the correct order, but they've given you 7 steps on the left there. So you have to pick out which are the real steps and which are the ones you don't need to do, as well as putting them in the right order. So there's quite a bit to this question. So the first one is assign the backup policy to the 10 VMs. That sounds like one of the later steps, not one of the first ones. But let's carry on. So then there's create a backup vault, which sounds very promising. But then if you look down here, there's one called create a recovery services vault. And I mean, maybe if you're not familiar with how this works, you might think you need to do both, a recovery services vault and a backup vault. But in fact, you only need to do one of them. So you have to know which one is the right one. And considering that this service is called Azure Backup, it seems logical that you'd create a backup vault rather than a recovery services vault. But actually, that's not right. It is a recovery services vault that you need to create for Azure Backup. Okay, so that's the first thing you need to do. Then looking through these, what else do we have? We have configure capacity trigger, which, okay, I'll admit it, I just made that up. There isn't such a thing. But you know, it could throw you off if you're not positive you know everything about Azure Backup. Then there's manually initiate the first backup, which sounds like it's probably something at the end of the process. There's create snapshots of the 10 VMs, which sounds like a possibility, but the point of the Azure Backup service is that it's going to create snapshots or whatever method it uses to back up these VMs. So you don't need to do that manual step. Then there's configure the backup policy, which is something that you would likely need to do before you assign the backup policy. So now if we put that all together, here's the way the order comes out. We've got create a recovery services vault, configure the backup policy, assign the backup policy to the 10 VMs, and manually initiate the first backup. And you can see that on the left, we've got the other 3 steps that didn't need to be done. This question is actually not all that difficult when you take a look at what the steps are on the right. It's pretty straightforward actually. But it does take a while to sift through all these things to make sure you've got the right steps in the right order. And bearing in mind that if you've got 2 hours to do approximately 50 questions, that means you only get around 2 minutes per question, right? And so you have to bear that in mind, that you need to go through these questions relatively quickly. Now, some of them you can go through fairly, like the first question we had here was something you could probably do in less than a minute if you knew about Azure Key Vault. This one might take you a slightly longer, and you'll see some questions later on that will take even longer. But okay, here we go. Question number 5. An Azure subscription named Subscription 1 contains 3 resource groups named Development, Test, and Production. Bob, Tracy, Larry, and Gail have been assigned roles via role-based access control, also known as RBAC, to access Subscription 1 resources. Bob has been assigned the contributor role for the Development and Test resource groups. Larry can perform read and write operations on all resources in the Development and Test resource groups. Gail is an owner of the Development and Test resource groups. Tracy is an owner of Subscription 1. If necessary, who would be able to delete the entire development resource group and all resources within it. Choose all correct answers. Okay, so this is an example of a question that might take you at least 2 minutes to go through, because it's going to take some thinking. Just reading it takes a while. All right, so Bob has been assigned the contributor role for the development and test resource groups. So the question is, can a contributor delete resource groups and all the resources within them? I'll let you think about whether you think that's true or not. Larry can perform read and write operations on all resources, but that does not mean that he'll be able to delete the resource group. He can just perform read and write operations on the resources in the resource group. So he can't delete those resource groups. Gail is an owner of the development and test resource groups. So does she have the ability to delete the resource groups and the resources in them? And I should say that when you delete a resource group, it does delete all the resources in it. So basically you're asking, can somebody delete a resource group? And yes, the owner of a resource group can delete it. So for Gail, the answer is yes. Tracy's an owner of subscription 1. Can the owner of a subscription delete resource groups within that subscription? And the answer is yes. So the answers are Bob, Gail, and Tracy. Now, I have shown this question to other people in the past, and I almost always get comments from some people saying that Bob should not be able to delete the resource group. They don't think contributor is a role that's capable of deleting a resource group. But I'll tell you that I've actually tried it on the platform, and it does work. If you just have the contributor role, you can delete a resource group. And this is what I recommend. If you're studying something and you're just not sure about how something works, actually try it out. That's the ultimate way. That's even better than reading the documentation. Try it out on the platform. And you can see here, I've got a little picture of a management group, a subscription under that, a resource group under that, and the resources underneath that. The reason I have this picture is to show that if you're the owner of a subscription, so this is specifically for Tracy, then you have ownership for the things underneath that as well. You have ownership for the resource groups that are in that subscription. And that's why the owner of a subscription can delete the resource groups. It still doesn't explain Bob, but that is the way it works, is contributors can do it. All right. Question number 6. This is another rather complex question. You have created the following inbound rules in a network security group called NSG1. So we've got this table here. I'm not going to go through and read everything in here, but maybe I'll just summarize. The key thing on the first line is port 22, and that we're allowing port 22. The other details are important too, but just sort of from an overview point of view, this is what matters. Okay, the second line is that we're allowing port 3389 through. And then the third line is that we're denying all ports. Okay. So you have assigned NSG1, this network security group here, to a subnet called subnet 1 with an address space of 10.1.1.0/24 in a virtual network called VNet1. Subnet 1 contains a virtual machine called VM1 with an IP address of 10.1.1.10. Which of the following statements are true? Select 2 answers. You can connect to VM1 from another VM in subnet 1 over SSH. The next one is you can connect from the internet over RDP. Third one is you can connect from the internet over SSH. And the fourth one is you can ping VM1 from another VM in subnet 1. So to figure out which ones are true, you actually need to know a lot of things. So let's look at the first one. Connecting to VM1 from another VM in subnet 1 over SSH. Now, so first of all, you have to know that SSH goes over port 22 and that RDP goes over port 3389. Right, so those are really key things to know. You might be able to just guess if you didn't know that, but it's good to know those. Those are 2 very important ports. So looking at the first line, because we're talking about SSH here, it's saying the protocol is TCP, which is the protocol for SSH. The source is virtual network, and the destination is 10.1.1.10. So that means any traffic coming from anything in this virtual network that's attached to NSG1. That's what we're talking about here. And the destination, if it's going to that IP address, which is the IP address of the virtual machine called VM1. All right, so this is definitely the rule we need to look at for answer A. And it says that it's allowed. So if we're coming from another VM in subnet 1 over SSH, it's allowed. So A should be correct. However, looking at the rest of the table, you see that the last rule there says that traffic coming from a source of 0.0.0.0/0 and going to this VM1's IP address, that traffic should be denied. And it's saying over any port, 0 through 65,535. So port 22, of course, is one of those ports in that range. So this rule says that traffic should be denied, potentially. Again, there are a couple things you need to know here. So the source, if the source is all those zeros, what that means is any source. That can be absolutely any source of traffic, right? So that would still apply to this situation. We're talking about another VM in subnet 1. The key thing to note, though, is the priority column, which we haven't talked about yet. So the first rule has a priority of 120, and the last row has a priority of 190. And the key thing you need to know is the lower priority number is the one that takes precedence. So 120 actually overrides 190. So we can ignore that deny rule at the end because 120 is more important. So there was a lot that went into figuring out whether answer A was true or not. Okay, but we've determined that it is true. Now B, you can connect to VM1 from the internet over RDP. So we're talking about RDP, which is port 3389. So let's look at row number 2. The protocol for RDP is TCP. That's fine. The source says the traffic can come from anywhere because it's all zeros. And that includes the internet. All right. So in this case, we're talking about connecting over the internet. So this applies. The destination is the subnet that VM1 is in, right? It's in subnet 1. And the action is allow. So you can connect to VM1 from the internet over RDP. And again, the third row doesn't apply here because it has a lower priority. It has a higher number, which means it's a lower priority than rule number 2. Okay, so both A and B are correct. Now we could just say at this point, we've found both correct answers and we would select those. But let's go through the other two just to make sure we've selected the right ones. So C, you can connect to VM1 from the internet over SSH. Now the SSH rule says that the source has to be virtual network. It's not all zeros, so there's nothing about the internet there. So that rule does not apply. Now the third rule, this deny rule that has a priority of 190, that one actually kicks in because the scenario we're talking about does not match either of the first two rules. So the third rule is the one that applies. It's going to deny that traffic. So C is not true. Okay, answer D, you can ping VM1 from another VM in subnet 1. So you have to know something here too, which is that ping is a different protocol, right? Ping is ICMP, and that doesn't show up in either of the first two rules because ICMP doesn't go over those ports. So the third rule applies again, and that rule says to deny that connection. So that was a lot, right? It's a lot to go through, especially if you've only got about 2 minutes. Now, this one might take you more than 2 minutes to go through, but you'll probably have other questions that take less. So, it's okay. But you do have to go at a pretty good pace in this exam. Question number 7. A client has an Azure site-to-site connection, or S2S, between an on-premises location and an Azure Virtual Network called VNet1 using a route-based Azure VPN gateway. This client has a requirement for all internet-bound traffic from virtual machines in VNet1 to be routed back to the on-premises location for inspection. So any traffic that's bound for the internet has to get rerouted through the on-premises location first, and you'll have something there that will automatically inspect the traffic. And then, assuming it passes inspection, it will go on out to the internet. So it has to sort of take this detour. Which of the solutions would best meet the requirement? A, create point-to-site connections between the VMs and client machines at the on-premises location. Well, would that actually do anything, right? Now, you do need to know what point-to-site connections are. And those are used when you're connecting individual devices or individual machines to the virtual network. So just by connecting individual machines to the virtual network, that doesn't actually accomplish what we're trying to accomplish here, which was this rerouting to the on-premises environment. So that one's out. B, configure forced tunneling to route internet-bound traffic from the VMs to the on-premises location. Well, it sounds very promising, but you would have to know what forced tunneling is. And let's just say that you don't know. So we'll carry on here. Answer C is create another site-to-site connection between the on-premises location and VNet1 using a policy-based VPN gateway. So in this case, it helps to know that you can have either a route-based or a policy-based virtual network gateway or VPN gateway. And in the question, it says that we're using a route-based one, and here it's saying to create another connection that uses the policy-based type. Really what you need to know from this is that a policy-based gateway uses static routes. A route-based one uses dynamic routes. So that doesn't really accomplish anything. I mean, it might sound sort of plausible because maybe you have a static route that routes everything through the on-premises location, but that's not really how you do this. Okay, then answer D is configure BGP on the VPN gateway to route internet-bound traffic from the VMs to the on-premises location. Well, that one sounds kind of promising too, right? And you'd have to know what BGP is as well. Now, BGP is something that you can turn on a route-based gateway that allows for dynamic route updates. So if you change your routes, it will automatically flow through and get updated everywhere. But that doesn't actually solve the problem. That doesn't force all the traffic coming from VNet1 to go through the on-premises location. So that's actually not the correct answer. The correct answer is B, because this scenario is exactly what forced tunneling is meant to do. It's meant to force all of the traffic to go through a certain route. All right, so if you didn't know all of these details, you might be able to guess this question, but it's still a little bit tricky. If you knew what forced tunneling was, then this is a very easy question. If you don't, then you have to think about it for a while. All right, on to the last sample question, number 8. This one's quite long as well. You're designing a records management application on Azure App Service. You configure the following scale out rules. Scale out by one instance if CPU utilization is above 60%. Scale up by two instances if CPU utilization is above 80%. Scale up by one instance if message queue length reaches more than 1500. The following scale in rules are also applied. Scale in by one instance if CPU utilization drops below 35%. Scale in by two instances if CPU utilization drops below 20%. Currently, your application is at 25% CPU utilization, and the message queue length is 1600 messages. What scaling action will your application perform? Does it scale out by two instances? Does it scale in by one instance? Does it scale out by one instance? Or no scaling action will occur? There is a lot of information to sift through in this one. You're not even sure if it's going to scale in or scale out. So let's look at scale out first. Your application is at 25% CPU utilization. So it's not going to trigger either one of these first two rules. because it's below 60%, it's below 80%, it's only at 25%. So those rules are not going to kick in. However, it also says the message queue length is 1600 messages, which is more than 1500. So that means we would scale out by one instance. However, if we look down at the scale in rules, we see that if the CPU utilization drops below 35%, then we scale in by one instance. And the CPU is below 35%, it's at 25%. So this says that it should scale in by one instance. It wouldn't scale in by two instances because it's not below 20%. So we've got two conflicting rules here. We've got that it scales out by one because of the queue length, and it scales in by one because it's below 35%. So you have to know which way it goes on in a situation like this. How does it resolve this sort of conflict? And what you need to know is that Azure App Service does something very sensible, which is that a scale out rule will always override a scale in rule. And that's because if you've got something that says you should be scaling out, then scaling in is just going to make things worse, right? So scale out should always override it. So the answer is C, scale out by one instance. All right, that's it for the sample questions. On to exam tips. First off, go through Cloud Academy's AZ-104 exam preparation learning path. It's probably not too surprising I'm saying this because this is one of my learning paths. And it contains video-based courses, hands-on labs, and practice exams. And if you take this learning path, don't skip the required reading material at the end of the learning path. I have a document that just has some links in it to some Microsoft documentation. You need to go through those. And that's because those topics were not covered anywhere else in the learning path. They're not huge topics, right? These are just little topics that weren't covered anywhere. And there's a good chance you'll see these things on the exam. So make sure you read the documentation pointed to by these links. Okay, of course, get a high percentage on our AZ-104 practice exam. Now, we can't guarantee that if you get, an 80 or a 90% on your practice exam that you're going to for sure pass Microsoft's exam, but you definitely should be getting a high percentage as a first step. I also recommend that you review Microsoft's AZ-104 exam guide, look through all of the topics that are listed, and make sure that you know something about all of those topics. Now, when you take the actual exam itself, first of all, check in at least 15 minutes before the start time. You should receive an email from, it's typically Pearson VUE is who runs the exams for Microsoft. The email should tell you how much ahead of time you need to check in, and it might actually be 30 minutes rather than 15 minutes. But make sure you check in before the start time and check that email to make sure when you should come in. Manage your time in the exam. As I mentioned, you need to spend somewhere around 2 minutes per question. So when you've gone through, let's say, 10 questions in the exam or something, then you look and see how much time you've taken and see if you're pretty close to being on track based on the fact that you need to spend around 2 minutes. So if you've gone through 10 questions, has it taken you around 20 minutes, to try to stay on track? One thing to bear in mind too is that they quite often will put case studies near the end, and if not at the very end. And case studies typically take a little bit longer to go through because there's so much reading you need to do. And so it's best if you're getting questions that are relatively short at the beginning, try to go through them fairly quickly. There's a countdown timer in the exam where you can take a look. They actually won't allow you to wear a watch or anything like that. So you have to look at the countdown timer to see what you're doing. But don't obsess about it, right? Like don't constantly be looking at the countdown timer because it's kind of stressful to be seeing this constantly ticking down, Okay, you can mark a question for review if it's taking up too much of your time. So then when you get to the end of the exam, it will give you an opportunity to just click on that question that you want to go back to. It'll take you right there. And then you can, if you have some extra time, then you can go through that question and try to answer it. However, as I mentioned earlier, some questions don't allow you to go back, specifically those ones, the true false with repeated scenario. So bear that in mind too, that you can't go back to those questions. Here's the strategy that I use with case studies. Read through the case study quickly, just sort of skim the information that's in there so that you get a basic overview of what's in that case study. And then read the relevant sections in more detail later when you go through the questions. So each question only needs some of the information in the case study. And so, for example, maybe this particular question is about security. So you can look in the security section of the case study. And you don't need to read through the entire case study in detail for that particular question. You mostly just need to read through the security section. It's still important to skim the whole thing first, though, just to make sure there's not something else in there that's going to be relevant to this question. But anyway, I think that's a good general approach for going through case studies. For remote exams, read the rules carefully and follow their instructions. I have had some bad experiences with taking remote exams, where twice actually. Now I've taken a lot of remote exams, so most of the time it's been fine. But a couple of times I actually got kicked out of the exam because, well, in one case it wasn't because of something I did. It was because my computer decided to do a system update right at the beginning of the exam, and their software interpreted that as being a violation. And in that case, it actually took a week before they let me take the exam again while they reviewed everything. In the other case, it was actually because I looked away from the screen for 5 seconds or something while I was thinking about a question. And so this is why I say you need to follow their instructions. You need to read the rules carefully, because it says you need to be looking at the screen the whole time, right? If you're looking away, then it thinks maybe you're trying to cheat. So anyway, that time I got back into the exam after about 45 minutes after I contacted technical support and everything. But it's actually, when you're taking remote exams, they're much more strict than if you go to a testing center, which you might not have intuitively thought of that would be the way it is. But if you think about it, it makes sense, because if you're taking it remotely, there's no one else there to make sure that you're not up to anything, right? That you're not cheating somehow. And so they're very strict when you take it remotely. So bear that in mind. Having said all of this, try to relax. If you're relaxed, it will be easier. And you don't have to get a perfect score. So on Microsoft exams, you need to get 700 points out of 1,000, which sounds like it's 70%, but they say that they could scale things up or down. So it's maybe not exactly 70%, but it's somewhere around there. Like, what I'm trying to say is you can get some wrong and it's okay. Just don't get too many wrong. And even if you do get too many wrong, you get below 700, you can retake the exam. And yes, you do have to pay for it the second time, but it's really not that big a deal. You can actually take it quite a few times. So do try to relax and don't worry too much. All right, that's it for the prepared material. Now it's time for the question and answer session. So let me know what's on your mind.
So one of the questions is, will the slide deck be available for download? And we don't actually send out our slide decks, but the video will still be available afterwards. So you can just look through the video if you wanted to look at the questions again. Because I'm assuming that's what people want to look at again, is the sample questions. That's the most popular part of these webinars. Let's see. Some questions are really big. Reading this to understand may take some time. Do we have any negative marking for wrong answers? No, there's no there's no negative marking for wrong answers, thankfully. Okay. Can we go back to previous questions? You can, for the most part. But I did mention there's those true false with repeated scenario questions where you can't go back once you've gone on. And they're sometimes also, they'll have like a section of the exam, let's say before they start a case study, they'll say, okay, you can go back and review any of the questions you've done so far. But as soon as you move on from that section, then you can't go back to any questions in that section. So let's see. If there are 2 or more correct answers, will this information be added to the question? Yes, they always tell you how many, excuse me, how many correct answers there are, or like how many steps you need in a procedure or anything like that. Can I use an external monitor on a PC, or is only laptop allowed? You can't use an external monitor. You cannot use an external monitor. How much does it help to have knowledge and experience in GCP or AWS, or does it hurt? That's an interesting question. I mean, it probably helps a little bit, but most of these things are very specific to Azure, so probably doesn't help a lot, to be honest. I have a lot of experience with GCP and some with AWS, and but to your question of does it hurt? Occasionally I'll get mixed up and think of something that's on the GCP side, but that's pretty rare. So sometimes it does help, actually. Let's see. Is it still the case that you can book the AZ 104 exam without doing the entry-level exam, which I assume you mean AZ 900 by that? Yes, you still can. You don't need, there are no prerequisites for this. Do you recommend taking mock-up tests? I assume by that you mean practice tests, and I definitely recommend doing that. And we do have practice tests in our learning path. Are the questions based on how fast or how right you do the answers? It doesn't look at your speed. It's just whether it's correct or not. Right, are questions with multi-part answers given partial credit, or are they marked all or nothing? That's a great question. You do get partial marks, and they do tell you that. They'll say in the question, you know, you get 1 point per correct answer or something like that. Can you read the questions out loud when taking remotely? No, you can't. That's one of the rules. You're not allowed to talk at all. And you might think that, well, I'm not going to talk during the exam, but you'd be surprised at how much people talk to themselves, right? I fall into this trap sometimes where I have to stop myself from reacting to the question like, oh, come on, you know, and they ask a question that I don't like, but you can't talk. And that's probably the case if you're doing it at a testing center too. I don't think they want you to talk there either. Let's see. Yeah, I think someone else just asked the same question basically about part marks, so I've answered that already. If you are recertifying because your certification has expired, is there a big difference with the full certification? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. I'm assuming what you mean is that Microsoft changed things a while ago so that now to renew you have to renew your certification every year, but you don't have to, you know, pay money to take the exam. You don't have to do this sort of high stakes exam like you did the first time. You just take an online exam, and you know, there's nobody monitoring you or anything like that, and you can retake it just about as many times as you want to pass and get your renewal. So I definitely recommend doing it that way rather than letting it expire, because once it has expired, you have to go back and take the full exam, and it is much more difficult than the renewal. Well, I shouldn't say that. The questions, I would say the questions are just as difficult for that online renewal exam. It's just that there aren't as many of them and there's not as much pressure, right? You don't have the time pressure and you can retake the exam easily and all that sort of thing. So how many need to be correct answers? Well, you need a score of 700 out of 1,000, which, you know, is probably close to 70%, but Microsoft does say that they can scale. They scale the scores somewhat. And so it might not be exactly 70%, but it's probably around there somewhere. And so I can't tell you the exact number of correct answers because because the number of questions in the exam varies and they have multi-part questions and things like that. Let's see. How many days are required for preparation? Yeah, that's a hard question to answer, and someone always asks it. I would say, I mean, it really depends on how much knowledge and experience you already have, but there's a lot of preparation required for this exam. Probably, as you could have seen from the sample questions that we had, some of those require an incredible amount of knowledge to answer correctly. I would say you probably need something like 100 hours of studying is my guess. I could be off, and it does depend on your existing level of knowledge, but it is a significant amount of studying you need to do. And I give it in hours rather than days because it depends how many hours per day you study. Let's see. Okay, I do not have any hands-on experience as an Azure administrator. Would I be able to pass the AZ-104 exam with the practice tests and labs alone from Cloud Academy? Maybe some practice I can try out from my personal Azure account. Yeah, I would say because we do have the hands-on labs, that helps a lot. And so I would say that you don't actually need to have separate hands-on experience like with your own account. I mean, it probably helps, of course, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary to pass. You should be able to from just the courses, the practice tests, the hands-on labs we have, all that sort of thing. Let's see. Do we have to do labs for this exam? If so, how long does it typically take? I mean, you don't have to, but I actually find that doing the labs really deepens your knowledge, because when you're just watching a course or you're just reading documentation or things like that, you don't really get it's harder to remember, I find, than if you actually go in and do it for real. When you do it for real, you kind of see how everything works. And so I do recommend it. I mean, technically you don't have to do the labs to pass. I would say you can probably get away with not doing them, but I still do definitely recommend it. Occasionally we'll have a topic that's really only covered in one of the labs, although that's pretty rare. Let's see. I just passed AZ 900. I'm planning to take SC 900. Will SC 900 help me at least on a few questions on AZ 104? Yeah, it would probably help you a bit. I have to admit I haven't taken SC 900. I've taken lots of Azure exams, but I haven't taken SC 900. But I suspect that it would help you somewhat because there's some overlap between those. There's a good question. Does the exam include hands-on labs? Now, there was a time when it did. I don't think I took it when it did, but it definitely had live lab tasks you had to perform on the exam at one time. And they did that for quite a few of the exams. AZ-104 was, I mean, before it was AZ-104, it was AZ-103 or AZ-100 or whatever. They did have labs, but they haven't had live labs on the exams for, it's been a while now. It's been at least a couple of years, I would say, maybe even longer than that. So I haven't heard anything about the labs coming back on the exams. So I'm guessing you wouldn't have those. But if they do, it would really help if you had some hands-on lab experience. So, let's see. Knowing Microsoft always updates its exam content. How relevant are the practice tests in Cloud Academy, or is there any useful links to look at? I'm taking AZ 104 by the end of July. So we track very closely when Microsoft updates its exam guides, which they do on a fairly regular basis. I think AZ 104 hasn't been updated for a while though, if I remember right. And so when the exam guide changes, then we do go in and we make changes to our learning paths, including the questions. There probably will be a bit of a lag, I'll tell you that, but because AZ 104 hasn't changed for a while, it should be okay. Do you advise to learn only from the tests? I know some people prefer such a learning path. You could do it that way, maybe if you had a lot of knowledge already. It's pretty tough to just take practice exams if you don't already have quite a bit of knowledge. So I mean, maybe if you're somewhat experienced, but I would recommend doing more than that. Also, you know, taking some courses and hands-on labs. And there's another question here that's kind of similar to that about practice exams. And see, we're almost at the end of time here, but someone asked if there are, they say practical questions. Practical questions are there or only multiple choice questions, kind of? So I did answer that early in the webinar that it's not just multiple choice questions. There are lots of different types of questions. I'm taking it this weekend. Anything I can do to brush up on things? Yeah, I mean, just the same things I've already been saying, basically, that, you know, you should be taking practice exams. You should go through Microsoft's exam guide, look through all the topics and make sure that you know something about all those topics. And then, you know, if there's somewhere where you're weak, then go back and take a course or, yeah, likely a course. Okay. And I think that's all we have time for, and that's pretty much the end of our questions. So that worked out pretty well. So if there are any questions in here I didn't answer that are related to the AZ 104 exam, there are a couple questions here that don't seem to be related to it, but if there are any, then I will answer them separately in email to the people who asked them. And with that, I will hand it back to Tia.
Awesome. Thank you, Guy, for providing that information and those great tips for passing the AZ 104 exam. Now, before everybody closes their tabs and parts way, I just want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. We hope that you found it informal and helpful. Today's webinar was recorded and it will be shared with you within the next 36 hours. In case you would like to share with a colleague or you missed part of the beginning or you got distracted of some sort. Again, there'll be a brief webinar survey that pops up at the conclusion of this webinar. So please take a moment to help us improve. Additionally, I did see that there was a question asking about other webinars. We do have more on-demand webinars on our website at cloudacademy.com/webinars. That would also be the page that you could find upcoming webinars. And I believe that is it. So on behalf of Cloud Academy, we thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day and that we get to see you soon.